Hi, this is Eyal Shai, and you're about to hear an installment out of a series called Deep Hanging Out Community. It's me speaking with my friend Catherine Widowis about community and different aspects of community, like society versus the individual, the dark side of community, how to establish communities and maintain them, and much more. So I hope you enjoy.
Hello, Ayal. It's good to be back here.
It is good. Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to see your face.
So, we have been chatting about community and belonging and what this means kind of structurally and socially. But something we haven't yet talked much about is our own personal experiences with it when we've experienced a sense of belonging, communities we've helped to build or join, and what have you. So, I'm really curious to hear your story of community. If you think about this could go so many places because you've lived a long and illustrious life. But if you think about maybe childhood, what did community mean for you growing up?
Yeah. So I grew up on a kibbutz, which is a communist, I think I mentioned it, but a communist type of community at its heart. It's not anymore, but that's how it was founded, where people pooled resources and manpower and everything. So I was born into a transition period of the kibbutz. It wasn't so strict as it was in the beginning. There was money. It was actually doing quite well. And I had a very, very happy childhood in terms of the community, because I have many friends who are close in age to me. And yeah, it's just the type of place where it's super safe to go anywhere, even when you as a young child. So there's no kind of boundaries where you can go even outside of the kibbutz, and even on some level it's borderline irresponsible, like the
Hmm.
lack the lack of overseeing that we enjoyed. But it was very, very happy. But ever since childhood, and this is something to ponder on, ever since childhood, it seems to me that I was just not the kind of person who very easily sees himself as an organic part of a tight-knit community. So
Hmm.
it seems that there's some grain of individuality in my
Hmm.
psyche that is just there. So maybe a good example to show this would be the national anthem of Israel. So it's in Israel you have a Memorial Day, and then it's immediately followed by Independence Day in May. And so there are these 2 days where you go to the center of the kibbutz, and first the flag is taken to halfway down. I blank on the name of that. But so there's this whole like somber ceremony, and you sing the Tikva, the national anthem, and then a day later you have Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, and you sing the national anthem again, so on. And I remember as a child, like I really, when I was naive, I really enjoyed singing with everyone. Of course, I did not know any of the words. Like I haven't had a conception of what they really convey and all that. Some people say it's a racist anthem. Like I can see that. But anyway, I really enjoyed having this communal moment with everyone when we're all singing our hearts out, right? But at a quite young age, I was like, I just started having this feeling that it's wrong to do anything that is at that level of many people becoming one, because I
Hmm.
recognize somehow that it could also be dangerous in some way,
Hmm.
or something like that. So I think it exemplifies this something in me that doesn't really allow me to completely coalesce into a community. And I wonder if that is something that is really going anywhere or not. And I'm
Yeah.
saying that looking forward, but
Yeah. I'm
that's a
so
little bit.
interested in that tension that you felt of having what sounds like largely a really happy and kind of welcomed and welcoming childhood in this sense of community, but also feeling that sense of maybe even suspicion or a little bit of wariness, maybe is a better word. I'm curious, where do you think that comes from?
So I've no idea. The only
Hmm.
thing I can surmise is that it has to do with the fact that ever since I was young, I was clearly different, because when I was 3 or something like that, I already knew how to identify every car I saw on the road, like the maker and model. And then it moved on to countries of the world and flags, and it was like this super nerd, high intelligence type of boy. So
Mm-hmm.
I was different. And in that regard, for as long as I remember myself, I'm different, right? And to be in a community,
Mm.
maybe you need to kind of be happy that there are many people like you around you. But it's also a thing with the kibbutz too. So the kibbutz had the kibbutz education. We would go to school with neighboring kibbutzim, and the tendency is to homogenize
Mm.
people. And this is especially bad for gifted children. Okay, so I have my eldest sister. She's 15 years older than I am, and I'm still pissed off about that. You know, she's not made more of her life, because I think she would have liked to. And the education here did not allow her that. There was just this homogenization, and bringing the leaders of the pack back to the peloton. Yeah, so I think that could be it.
Yeah. Seeing the sense, the force of anyone that could kind of go too far ahead is sort of brought back to stay in with others. I was going to say stay in line, and I think there's a way in which that's true. That's a different form of keeping people in line, is sort of controlling people's talent or ambition almost. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So how long were you on the kibbutz? When did you leave? And what did leaving look like?
Yeah, so as soon as I finished my army service, I did not waste time. Maybe a month after my release, I was already in America in this other community, off the grid homestead in Georgia, in middle Georgia, like a hippie haven type of thing that attracts just the most liminal characters of society. So weirdos, people struggling with mental health issues, people looking for themselves, people who are ideologues, people who would go on to become monks after that. Ex-felons, just generally downtrodden people, like a very interesting mix. And yeah, so 21 years I was in the kibbutz, I'd say. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And military service also is interesting, because you were talking about that sense of kind of seeing everyone gathering around the flag and saying, I don't know about this. Were you already feeling that before you served in the military? Or was that something different?
Yeah. It was such a mistake to go in the military. I mean, it is mandatory, and but they get you to do, like, for an assessment when you're 16. And at that time, I was not sure enough of myself. This is not what I wanted. So what I did do is, on the first day when I did go into the army, I went to the mental health officer and managed to get my profile number down, so I wouldn't go to combat, because I knew I didn't want to do that. So I told them, when the time came, I would just put my rifle down and go home. Like, I'm not going to be there. And so that helped a bit. And through some connections, I also got myself to be a personal driver for an officer, and then later on even go even closer to home, and just go back home every day. At this point, I had my own apartment, the kibbutz, because people would get it when they're 16, would get their own apartment in this apartment complex that's in a different side of the kibbutz than their parents' houses,
Oh,
which
wow.
which was an interesting part of the community. Now that I think about it, that was a good perk. Yeah, and then midway, halfway through my service, I also tried to get out of the army on mental reasons, but they wouldn't let me out because it was a real life catch-22. They're like, "Oh, you're saying you're crazy to get out of the army," and I was like, "What?" And every sane person would do that. So,
Yeah.
um,
Wow.
yeah, and
Yeah. That's
so
like
I did finish it in the end, 3 years. But it was definitely not easy, and I was sabotaging anything I could in the army, trying to disappear for as long as I could. Yeah, just raise trouble for the people who are jailing me there.
So you were there for what, 6 years, you said?
3, yeah.
3. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like you were very much ready to be done with it.
Oh, yeah.
So then how did you find yourself on a farm in Georgia? And you mean the state of Georgia, the
Yeah,
US.
the state of
Okay.
Georgia. I have visited the country of Georgia when I was 17, so I'm one of the lucky few who have been to both Georgias. I'm sure there are not many.
Yeah.
And yeah, well, basically, there's this thing called WWOOF, WWOOF, and it's Willing Workers on Organic Farms. It's an organization that that matches volunteers with farm owners so that people can go and for room and board volunteer on farms. And it's usually not a full-time job. It's like 4 or 6 hours a day. So it's a wonderful opportunity to learn a lot, to meet, to travel in a very different way, because you're going to be living with locals and getting to know, it's not a touristy thing. And I knew I wanted to fly for a long time, and I have American citizenship. Because I was thinking about Spain, but Spain I would have had to not stay for longer than 3 months. So opened the American WWOOF catalog and immediately went to the 2 most famous states, right? California and Florida, the Sunshine States and the Hollywood State and all that. And just called a bunch of farms, and for some reason it didn't work out. And I think in Georgia there was just 1 farm that was listed, right? It was not the usual thing in Georgia then. This was 2008, and just saw this amazing description of a farm. So I contacted Debbie, the owner, and she was just like, "I'd love for you to come, but you're coming from very far away. Know that it's a 3rd world country out here. It's off the grid. It's all that." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted." It was kind of I wanted that ascetic kind of hermit lifestyle, to really do that and make the most of it and really look deep within and find myself, as they say. So yeah, that got me there, and I fell in love with the place. Stayed for about 7 months. Then friends from back home came and we went on a road trip together. Yeah, so on and off I stayed there for about 2.5 years. Yeah, with the summer in Northern California and a few months in Tampa Bay, but overall like 2.5 years. Yeah.
So when you think about your long, your history on the kibbutz, growing up on the kibbutz, and then spending almost 2.5 years on a farm, what feels like community about each of those spaces? Because they sound like very different environments, even though you're living with several other people. What feels like community in both of those spaces? Are there any through lines, or would you describe, are those 2 different, very distinct forms of community?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in the kibbutz, a detail that I just want to blurt out there, even though it's not directly connected to any of what we're talking about, my kibbutz had this weird tendency of people not saying hello to one another. So I think overall it was a community, and they would shout at because it's like a direct democracy, right? Like one person, one vote, and everyone has the right, everyone who is a member, not the children. But you get accepted when you're 20 something or something, and you can vote on things. I'm not a member today. And so I don't know, it just kind of sets the atmosphere for what I'm going to say. But overall, as happy as I was growing up with my friends and stuff, I did not feel I did not feel like I belong, and neither did I want to belong in the kibbutz, and I certainly did not want to live my whole life in the kibbutz. So that would be like a nightmare for me, right? I want to get out there. I want to see the world. I want to explore. So community in that sense is something restricting, right? That's my instinctive answer to that. And in Georgia, it was a lot less restrictive because it was much more free-spirited, and all I needed to do was to be good to everyone when it comes to dishes and do 4 hours a day of work, So that was quite chill, and there was a lot of time to have fun. So it wasn't as restrictive, but with that too, it was an interesting, very interesting community, and because of the people coming and going, there was never really. I think today I'm not really in touch with that community anymore. I think today there's still like a kernel of some people at the core that keep coming back, but people come and go in that community. With a few people like myself and few other guys who have stayed longer stays, like 2 years, where and it's a place. It's a place for rehabilitation, I should say. It's not touted as that, but it is. From my experience, the people who have stuck the longest are people who needed to rehabilitate for something. So a couple of my friends from there were heroin addicts who came there. These are the people who stay because Debbie, the owner, has this amazing ability to project onto you the best that you could be, and it gives you belief in yourself, and you just become that better person. So it was so community in that sense there was more like stay here as long as you want, but it's also not this restrictive thing because people come and go by definition.
Something I think is so interesting is you talked about, you're talking about this community, which sounds wonderful, this farm community. And also you talked about it as a chance to kind of be this aesthetic, sort of solo monk-like figure. And it's interesting to think about. I think we often think of community as with people, and then individuation is I'm going off on my own and doing my own thing. But it sounds like you saw this place as a place for both at the same time, which is very cool.
Yeah, there was a lot of land there. It's like 50 acres. So everyone would wake up at like 10 a.m. or something and have like 3 coffees and then start doing their 4 hours of work. I would be done by 12 o'clock. I would be free. So I did not even, I wasn't even in sync with the rest of the people. And then I would just go out there and walk for hours, like 3 or 4 hours every day, easy. Just identifying the plants and thinking and hanging out at the end of the day. I'm not a hermit. Like I like the company, but I would spend a lot of time on my own, and that was part of the healing for sure. So there was definitely room for both. For both socializing and kind of going on your own. And the asceticism is really interesting. I just think it's not a coincidence that it appears in Siddhartha and books like that, and many other people are going down that path. I think you kind of owe it to yourself to shake off hedonism a little bit, which we need to do. So this is a pre-verbal kind of attraction to that. I think that is healthy. I don't think it's necessarily healthy to remain that, but it's good to wean yourself off of some hedonistic tendencies.
There are ways that, if you think of early monasteries, kind of the in the Christian tradition, sort of desert fathers and mothers who were ascetics in that way, but would start to, at some point, started to actually band together as a group of, intentionally sharing resources, but also being dedicated to solitude and that practice of kind of solitary contemplation, but then also the rhythm of the hours being, now is when we garden and now is when we pray, and there's still being that structure in there. It sounds kind of similar to that, which is interesting. And I do wonder about those who you're talking about that do kind of are driven by that more aesthetic mentality, kind of where we'll see that going, if that will be a similar impulse here. And for you, I don't know.
It's interesting.
I think something that's really interesting too here is the idea of communities serving different purposes. And I think one thing, we've talked about this a bit in our last two episodes, that the idea of being clear on what the purpose of a community is and how important that is the important thing just that we all like each other and want to be around, or is the important thing that we're sort of banding together for a purpose? And there's such different purposes that you just described. This idea of, a very kind of closed system on the kibbutz, and it's we belong to each other and we're all doing this together. But with that does come restriction. It comes a real code of behavior and belief, versus something like the woofing farm that is around rehabilitation, and that is it has to be looser that way. And I think that's interesting, the way that we talk about communities as being, there's just so many different models for it. And
that's, that's such a good point, because as individuals, we better know what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing, and what ends we're aiming at. That's such a good point. And it's interesting, because this is the first time that they said Salamander Springs, that farm in Georgia, was about rehabilitation. That was never a thing. That's not why Debbie started it. Like, she thought she was just going to live off the land or something like that. But I think in the end, it's undeniable that if it has proven to be anything consistently, is a place for people to heal, if I had to say that. And for the kibbutz, definitely it's this idealistic thing so it's like applying this theory on the ground of communism and how to structure a better world, but it's a very forceful type of ideology where you kind of erase yourself, right, for the greater good. And it's such a good point, and it's something that I'm actually going to take with me going forward, because I'm not sure that even today, and we haven't gotten today with the story, so maybe I'll just fill it in, because I don't know what I have to say about those 3 years between coming back to Israel and meeting my wife. I'll just say that I went to university and had the luck to start doing dialectic, and from there becoming a better friend to everyone. So when I met my wife, I was already being her friend by default when we met, and that helped. But the whole time with her, I think, was about creating our own little household, and then with her daughter being born, that's kind of where we are now. This cell, right? That's this like super tiny society of the three of us, and now we're looking to maybe find a community. But because you've just made this point, it makes me realize that maybe we haven't decided what is this community going to be looking at, and to me it's clear that the framing should be that it's a community that benefits all its members by allowing them to be mentally healthy, right? So it's kind of abstract, but this is what I would be looking for.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Yeah. So that's a bit where you are now, is living in your cell of these three,
Yeah.
and then looking for what a larger community could and would look like. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. What about
That's
you?
beautiful. What about me? Um, let's see.
This is a two-way interview, so we can see if we can
Ah,
be in the
dang
same
it.
community. Apparently.
I was hoping I was just interviewing you on this one. No. Yes. So, ideas of belonging and community and where they came from. So I think I had a pretty thick sense of community growing up, although I didn't always feel like I belonged. So I am the middle child of seven, and I feel like any talk about
No
belonging in
shit.
community,
I did
yeah,
not know that about you. 7.
surprise,
God.
yep. I feel like any conversation about belonging and identity and finding your voice and who you are and having your voice be heard has to come with that context first. And maybe that's the quintessential middle child thing to say, but um, I did grow up most of my childhood feeling a deep sense of belonging within my own nuclear family. And just my older siblings and I, and younger siblings too, were very close growing up. My mom taught each of us for a time where we each homeschooled for a few years before, another kid would come along and she'd send the first one off to school and homeschool the next few down the line. And I think that felt very rich and good. The larger context was that we were nowhere close to my extended family. I did not grow up with a robust sense of extended family like a lot of people do. A lot of people will grow up with uncles and aunts and cousins, and we had them, but only a few. We were definitely the big family of the families, and they all lived in the South, and we lived outside of Chicago. So there was that sense of a little bit of dislocation from a larger sense of family, even though there was belonging within the smaller unit. And geographic distance. I always sort of felt like an outsider growing up in the Midwest, even though most of my childhood was there, because I was clear, my parents were clear, everyone else was clear, we weren't really quote unquote from there. Which is very silly. That's a small regional thing, it's like, it's not, but that was real, that was there.
So they came from the South?
Yeah, both of my parents are from
state?
North Carolina.
Nice.
So which, depending on where you're from in the South, may or may not really count as the South, but
right,
to most people, I think
it's
it does.
the South, but not the deep South.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. And those little distinctions were just true in everything. The fact that I was homeschooled for the first several years and then started public school later, obviously I adjusted to that very quickly, but sort of the initial, peers' initial reactions to me as being previously homeschooled was something that I did not forget. There was a lot of, just the kind of people thinking I was weird and low grade bullying that you would expect. Nothing serious, but it stuck. So that kind of feeling that way. And another really interesting dynamic for me too was religion. I grew up in a family that went to an Anglican church, Episcopalian church. That is a certain kind of Protestant Christianity, but it looks very similar to Catholicism. Right. I basically describe it for those who are not familiar with different Christian traditions. I basically describe it as progressive Catholic, which is not actually quite true, but it's a shorthand for
it's Catholicism with divorce is what it is, basically. Well, the Anglican one, at least. So I don't know.
Yeah,
about
exactly. And then if you're Episcopalian, you also appreciate women in leadership. You're fine with gay marriage. That so there's differences, right. But a lot of the rituals and things look pretty similar to Catholicism. And I grew up in a town that was heavily evangelical Christian, which is very different. Yes. Very different. There is a lot of ritual, although they won't call it ritual. And it tends to be, it's just a very different kind of environment. And so it was interesting, even within growing up within one religion and being around ostensibly that same religion, but of a different stripe. That created a lot of, I had very different politics than most people I lived around. I had very different thoughts about how we engage the world. I had different thoughts about what belief even means and what religion even means, different thoughts about what that meant about how we should live our lives. And so it was, it was I largely had a very good childhood. But there were all of these little currents that just kind of kept telling me, you don't really know what belonging is. You don't really have a larger place that's yours.
Did you feel seen in your family, or is it are you drowning in a sea of siblings, and that there's like in terms of attention?
No.
No, what?
No, I did not feel seen, but I also, what's interesting is that's also not totally true. I felt I felt deeply cared for. And so that was non-negotiable, that was never in doubt, which is, I think, a very fundamental baseline that I'm really grateful to have had. Being seen, though, I think I didn't even know how to see myself, in all honesty. I think I didn't feel seen, but it's not because I felt like, in some ways it was just, there's too many kids drowning in a sea of siblings. The oldest ones are getting attention because they're the oldest and they're forging the newest path. The youngest ones are getting attention.
Right. Yeah. The middle.
So I'm just
ones.
I'm sort of like, I got it. I definitely learned how to be completely individualistic because of that. That's for sure.
Did you have like a moniker, like something, some distinguishing feature where you would put as like,
I'm like, this one's me.
The troublemaker, the whatever, the black sheep, the whatever, not necessarily, but no distinguishing feature.
No. No, of course that's not true, right? Like you could talk to any member of my family and they'd be like, sure, she was XYZ, but they probably all have different answers to that, which is interesting. I think what I did learn, I think I had trouble seeing myself. And what I mean by that is, I don't think I've ever said that out loud. So that's interesting. I think what I mean by that is I had such deep love and admiration for my parents, and I had deep love and admiration for my older siblings. And when you're a younger sibling, you get the benefit of watching the older ones and sort of seeing what they do that you like, and seeing what they do that works, and seeing what they do that definitely does not work. And you get to be like, oh, well, I will not do things that way. Thank you. I have learned to not do it that way. And so I think my attention was always either on my older siblings and my parents, and just sort of getting to bask in whatever wisdom or goodness they were sharing, or it was in books. I was an avid, I would steal away and sit in the corner of the library. And that kind of felt like my act of autonomy was, I'm going to go to the public library and find the fantasy book section and just sit there and read for hours. Hours, like more than once. My parents came to the library frantic, not knowing where I was. So that was, I think, but in some ways that was my act of, this is my own space, my own time. I'm doing what I want because no one else was going with me. But in other ways, I was still getting lost in other people's worlds. I wasn't making things or deep in my own thoughts. I was kind of avidly soaking up everybody else's. So yes, I think it's, I feel quite lucky in the sense that I never felt like my belonging within my nuclear family was in question. And I know that is not a given, and I'm very grateful for it. But I think any sort of larger sense of community or belonging, or even my ability to kind of belong to myself, and feel like my life is my own, that always felt very much more in question growing up. So yeah.
And so the first time that you left home was for college, like around that time? And did you go very far?
I sure did. Yep. I always knew I would. And that was also something that was very different. Most of my friends were looking at colleges nearby, and they all stayed in Illinois, and they all sort of knew that I was going to be the one that went off and did other things. And I did. I went to a school in Maine, which is a state. It's a state in the US. It's all the way.
It's Canada, I think.
It's next to Canada. Yeah, they fought very.
No, it is Canada.
Maine would have some thoughts about that. No, there's been it is not Canada and it's not Massachusetts, but yeah, I think I always knew that I wanted to go to school far away, and a lot of that was you know, I spent some of my childhood living overseas. I always wanted to travel. You know, it was a real kind of love for being in different environments, meeting different kinds of people, that kind of thing. But part of it was absolutely also, I need to go be my own person and feel my own feelings and think my own thoughts. You know.
Yeah, but that choice, let's discuss it, because if you feel progressive for the Midwest, usually you go just farther out west or something like that, or maybe like East Coast. I don't know, one of the bigger cities there. But Maine, that's like why Maine? What was the appeal? I'm asking this as a person who chose Georgia out of the 50 states available, you know, so totally. I know something about going where you're not expected to go.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of it. Maine is the East Coast, so there is that. And the school I went to is, it's a small liberal arts private college that was very much, it's one of the schools that are sort of the East Coast private liberal arts colleges. So in that sense, in the kind of progressive, highly educated progressive sense, it made, that was a linear choice.
Gotcha.
But I do think you're hitting on something interesting in terms of choosing Maine. I looked at a lot of different schools, and many of them were in Boston. They were in Philadelphia. They were, you know, in UNC or in Chapel Hill, or what have you. And something really appealed to me about Maine being sort of wilderness. It's a, you know, much less populated state. Certainly growing up in the Midwest, not a lot of people knew much about it. That was really appealing to me. It felt very new and different in that way. But then I showed up, and I think I loved it's just a gorgeous state. The topography is incredible. But I think I loved the sense that everything was smaller. It did feel like a chance to work through, you know, the ideal of college is kind of working through some of your mental models of the world and your own understanding of who you are in the world is. And I loved the idea of doing that in a smaller student body, in a state and on a campus that was fairly remote, or fairly sparsely populated and surrounded by trees and rocks and the ocean and birds. And that was lovely.
Sound lovely. Yeah. And what about,
and I hadn't thought of it as a sort of sub in for an aesthetic experience, but I actually think that probably factored in.
Okay. Yeah.
Some part of me was like retreat, even like simultaneous deeper engagement and retreat kind of happening at the same time.
Right. So there weren't as many distractions, like in terms of college life. I don't know what college culture is there in that school, but obviously for a lot of people, there are a lot of distractions during college. And you can, again, I think if you're the type of person who's happy to be acculturated into any culture, you're kind of going with that, and you can find yourself totally immersed in whatever novelties college has to offer, you know, in terms of like drug, sex, and rock and roll. What was culture like there, and did you participate in life, not just in this aspect of life, but I don't know, like school newspaper or something like that?
Yeah, I was gonna say there was definitely drug, sex, and rock and roll at this college too. But I think actually something that came to mind was growing up in a very my family personally was not upper middle class, but the suburb I grew up in was very generally wealthy. A very particular kind of white capitalist, generally Republican conservative society. Fine, but I always had the sense that was not me, and it was very clearly like I need to go find other models for what belonging and community look like. And I think I sensed that something that felt quite different could do that, or it could at least be a first step toward that. In terms of things I engaged in school, I really felt belonging for the first time in a way that felt entirely independent of my family and my childhood, I think, in a singing group I was part of in school. I was in an all-female a cappella group. I joined an a cappella group before learning that a cappella was a thing. It's, you know, I feel like I have to add that disclaimer because people are like very into it in a way that I'm like, I didn't know that that was a
Really,
thing.
I did not need that
Yeah,
disclaimer. I just don't know
great.
about it.
Yeah. This is before Pitch Perfect and all that. Anyway, it was a group of women, and what I loved was just those small indicators that people might be your kind of people. You know, there were a lot of different singing groups that felt on campus that felt very, I don't know, like there was a code. It was like everyone kind of dressed the same, everyone kind of looked the same. They were all singing the most popular songs. Everyone had a solo. You know, it's just kind of. And this group was women that were just clearly brilliant, and a lot of them were independent majors, like had created their own course of study, and in a variety of different, you know, feminist philosophy, deep like music and ethnography, just these really interesting combinations of inquiry that I was like, I already like your guys' brains. But the songs that we chose were much less kind of popular songs and more older songs or songs from a variety of traditions, and everyone would kind of orchestrate it in a way that no one had the solo. Everyone was singing together all the way through, which actually is, I think music is a really interesting form of community building and also community testing, where it's sort of like, how do you make music together, and how can you be truly collaborative and truly participatory in this form of art making? Anyway, that can all be another conversation, but this was the group that made me feel like, oh, I really admire everyone in this group, and in some ways I'm intimidated by everyone in it. And also I fully belong. I auditioned, they really want me, they're really glad I'm here, this is great. And that really felt like a cool early indication of belonging, I think.
Yeah. Do you still hold that as the standard for what you would be looking for in a way?
Oh, great question. I think I hold that as a standard when it comes to music specifically. So I play music, I sing and play violin, and I'm teaching myself guitar, although not in a dedicated way. I technically have been teaching myself guitar for 1.5 years, and I'm exactly as good as I was 1 year ago. So
maybe try the string on it and it'll work.
Yeah, exactly. I'll pick up a bow and see. Yeah, yeah. But I think I think that sense of belonging musically, understanding, I think what I got from that experience was understanding that when everyone is working toward a common purpose, and we believe in like the end product and what it can be, and everyone is playing their own part, and everyone is kind of responsible for it, but together we're all far more interested in what the whole product sounds like than we are in whatever our own part is. And so I could be singing one note the entire time, and that would actually be just as satisfying as me getting to sing the melody the whole time, because the end result is the sound. And we know that our roles and responsibilities are going to change with every song. No one person got all the best parts, and no one person was stuck with none of the fun parts. And so I think in terms of music making, that's the standard. And in terms of collaborative work, I think that also is still probably a standard for me. Belonging is a more interesting question. I haven't thought about it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's like you say, the belonging is just comfortable when you feel that you're contributing towards a shared goal. And yeah, but maybe before I go into theory, like what would be, or if you want to still go over like the time between college and then, like, what are some other places where you thought about community and how were things in Austin like?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of examples, but one thing One thing I did want to highlight, and I'm so sorry, I cannot remember if we've already talked about this on this podcast or if we've just talked about it in our conversations. So if I'm repeating, we can just cut this section. But one other thing that has become a real kind of litmus test for a sense of belonging and community for me is something that I was part of building in DC when I lived in Washington, DC. I lived there for about 10 years in between college and moving here to Austin. And I got involved in in hosting house concerts. And so I would host musicians in my living room and local musicians. And at the time I lived in a house that had a very small living room, but it had a big back porch and it actually had a little roof deck on top of our house as well. And so my favorite series then was I would host a series called the Tiny Roof Sessions, Tiny Roof Concerts, based off of the NPR Tiny Desk Concerts. And I would have a summer series where musicians would come up onto my roof deck and play unplugged acoustic music while the sun was setting behind them. And it was such a small venue, quote unquote, that, you know, spots would be very limited to about 20 people. Even that was pushing it with the weight limits, but that was what I was comfortable with. Yeah. And it was such a small gathering that no one would be on their phones because they would know how rude that was. The musician is right here in their face playing. But it was open air enough that no one would feel claustrophobic. You could always go back downstairs if you needed to. And it was just sitting and listening to acoustic music from wonderful musicians in the city as the sun set. And
That's beautiful.
It was beautiful. I was very proud of it.
I'm upset. Really I'm upset I never experienced it.
Yeah, well, we will someday. We'll figure out a way to make that happen again. But the larger point there is, I think I fell in love with playing music and being around others who played it. But I also fell in love with the possibility of bringing that into our homes, seeing our homes as a space for gathering, far beyond who owns the house and far beyond even who lives in it full time. And in DC, particularly, that was economically significant because DC is a very expensive place to live. And there are a lot of houses that can sleep 4, 5, 6, 7 people. There's, you know, houses, a lot of row houses with a lot of bedrooms. And so a lot of people my age, I was there for almost my whole 20s. A lot of people my age were living, you know, 6, 7, 8 adults in one house at a time. And what that automatically breeds, among other things, is like cooperative living. You have to learn how to share resources to some degree, but it also breeds a spirit of creativity and innovation. And it was a really interesting insight that basically a lot of venues at the time were charging taking major cuts away from musicians that were playing there. So musicians were getting a little bit screwed over by venues. People wanted to go see shows and didn't always have money to pay the ticket price. And people wanted to be able to host things that were important to them and meaningful. So the obvious solution to me and some others was use the space that you have. This space is underused. You want to use it in creative ways. Musicians have it real hard, and everyone wants to be able to see concerts. So that's the bottleneck. Let's have more. And we did not start hosting in DC, house hosting in DC. That was a long-standing tradition already. But what some friends and I realized was that we were meeting more and more people who were doing that, who didn't know about each other. And so we started hosting convenings between hosts that lived in all 4 quadrants of the city and training people how to host and getting a little bit of, you know, we added, you know, a schedule that people could find shows that were happening, or playing matchmaker between artists and venues. But otherwise, we were just sort of putting some light structure on what was already existing. And what I found about community in that regard was it was several of us that knew an existing place intimately and were able to start seeing the gaps in it and start seeing the opportunities in it and bring people together with resources we already had in a way that opened it up for a new use. And like radical things can come out of just hosting people in your living room in a different way. You know, it was like, there was nothing particularly innovative or groundbreaking about it. And like everyone knows about house show hosting networks. There's all kinds of commercial versions of that. So even that idea is not particularly shockingly new. What felt so special to me about it was that we were just realizing you start to get that repetition, you know, the same people start coming to house shows that you meet somebody in one person's home, which is already an intimate experience. And then a week later, you see them in another person's home on the other side of the city. And you're like, oh my gosh, it's you again. And oh my gosh, you were a musician that played at that show 4 weeks ago. And now you're here as an audience member. And that's so cool. And just being able to host people, to host each other in ways that are also about art and about just getting to all be together felt really important.
Yeah, that's great. And it really, you know, usually we speak of tight-knit communities where it sounds like you had a loose-knit community, which is kind of cool, more like people going in and out of a scene, but there definitely is a scene that's happening and enabling people to come meet together. And it's a lot like the inter-intellects, right? I just yesterday recorded with Anna Gutt. And yeah, so first of all, it's amazing that the idea of the inter-intellect didn't pop in your head, but in her head. But it sounds a lot like it, and it's wonderful. And I think that it does take some creativity to recombine these things, because you know, you meet some people, you love music, you have these houses, but it's not obvious that you could bring all of them together in that. And that sounds like more like one of those communities that's centered around a shared love, right? Because there wasn't anything long-term about it, or anything like that. So that's really interesting, because whatever community I would choose, or I will choose in the future, I wish for myself to find one that we really like. I would want to have both things, right? And that's something that the kibbutz lacked, because there was not a lot of spare time and resources in the beginning, especially for any sort of artistic endeavor. So a lot of the artists had to cook food or do menial jobs, you know, and that's what I was kind of talking about when I said that the culture didn't really let them soar for as high as they could have artistically. And it sounds like whatever community we want to be part of, we would want both these things to be there. And I think this good mix also would be present in the community which I would like to live in, which is a community that helps its members just be mentally healthy, you know. And I don't particularly care about the rules of that community at all, as long as it achieves the purpose of actually helping people, which is really interesting. I don't know if enough communities make sure that they have both these things together. That shared understanding that what they're doing, that is very much about life's biggest questions and mental health and so on, but also leave a lot of room for this fun type of community where people with shared interests are completely able to go and find their thing, even if it's outside of that community that is about the big things, right? So what happens if you go to the next city over? Well, really nothing. This is the kind of liberty that you should still keep living in a community.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the similarities between your experience woofing and my experience of house shows in DC are actually really interesting, because they both do feel like there's a couple of central nodes, there's kind of central hosts at play, but otherwise it is a very free come and go as you need. And that is interesting. I think inter-intellect is another good example of that. And it's interesting to think about the many different connotations we have with the word community and what we actually mean by it. Because as you were talking about kind of your impressions of what I had done, it almost makes me think of like networked belonging is different than is something different than like community, or maybe it's just that's one form of it. What's the sense of where do I feel like I belong versus what will support me in different ways, or kind of what supports me when the chips are down versus what supports me and elevates me to kind of be my best self versus where can I just show up and belong, and can all those three things live in the same mechanism or not? Feels like the juicy question that I certainly don't know the answer to, but
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, it's tempting to say that any online community of people who just meet on Twitter or any other place like that, it's natural for them to want to move in together and maybe make it into that. That won't necessarily work, because the reason you showed up or ended up, the Twitter algo is very good at putting us where we belong in some sense, and also makes it hard for us to ever leave. But it's definitely centered around a vibe to you or something like that, right? Like, and then there are the memes that this community shares and the shared ideas and whatnot. But there's almost no talk about more central, like deeper, abstract things like mental health. And this is super. I understand it. I'm fearing that for the rest of my life, I would be looking for that community, but just arriving at an agreement with one person about what this means and what this entails, if we are to share space and resources, is so difficult that it does seem overwhelming to take on the problem as a whole, with the stated goal of creating a community that serves everyone in terms of mental health. It does seem like a really big undertaking.
So this may be, I don't know if you have an answer to this question, but as you look ahead, the kinds of community that you're hoping for and what you would really love to see in the world, what do you see any communities or kind of existing networks that are demonstrating this sort of welcome and consideration for mental health? Or does this feel like a really clear gap that just...
I don't know if there ever was a community. I think obviously the idea behind communism and behind any sort of ideology that brings people together to try their hand at building community, I'm sure that everyone, just as they do in their personal lives, their aim is to live well in some sense that they not necessarily have conceived all the way through. But if any community has ever discussed and stated its role as being there for each member so that they may be mentally healthy, which I think is the highest good in this life, I don't think so. And it needs to be, this brings me back to pretty much the moment I met my wife for the first time. Like I said, at around that time, I had already understood that a friend is something that you need to be by default, and not something that just happens over time or something like that. From the first moment you meet somebody, already be the type of person that doesn't want to miss an opportunity to be a friend to that person, which means to benefit them and to assist them in their own journey towards living well. And we discussed it. We did dialectic on it, me and my wife, like quite early on, and I feel like that prepared the ground for the relationship, because we understood that we're there for the friendship, and this is what's there. So I think people are not accustomed to really doing dialectic and discussing what friendship is, but I think it's necessary in any community building. Whatever you have going on in terms of initial attraction, in terms of shared hobbies, in terms of all of you being on the same level financially or something, so that nobody feels like somebody's getting something they don't deserve or anything like that. All these types of fittingness are great, but I don't think they're going to carry you a very long distance. These all kind of fate, just because you both love music doesn't mean that you can live together or you have the same ethics in other ways and so on. So I do think that any community that wants to become needs to discuss these things on a philosophical level and decide and have everyone really understand, not just sign a paper, here are my duties, whatever, but really understand what it entails. And that's quite difficult because as we discussed in the previous episode, it's in the ancient world, it was easy because you really depended on these people. So that was it. For better or for worse, you would have a community because without it, you wouldn't survive. But in this day and age, I think we need to really talk about what brings us together and what we're here for and how we're going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And so maybe a closing question for you then would be, what if you were to what is a step toward kind of nudging this community along, or the birth of some sort of community around mental health look like for you? Do you have any ideas? What would kind of a step 1 or 2 look like?
Yeah, well, I guess I just have to talk about it more and mention it to more people and say, here's what we're gonna do. And because I have friends around here in the kibbutz, childhood friends, but I don't get to see them as much as I would like. And I think that we live in an individualistic world where each of us has their business or whatever career, and we're not there for one another as much as we should. And it's unclear what is going to bring us together. I had friends I discussed moving to a different part of Israel, and they were like, it's getting to be so expensive to buy a house here. Let's move to this other region. And I'm like, okay, but only in the condition that we're going to center our lives around some shared space or something like that, or business, something like that. Because if I'm going to move there, but I'm still going to see you, just have a sitting every few nights and talk for an hour, I'm not sure why we would do that. But I think it needs to be talked more. I think we should be aware that it's so easy to go with your initial attraction. If you fall in love with someone, yes, it's tempting to think that things are going to stay like that mentally, but of course we all know this is not what carries couples or communities forward a long while. And what is carrying people forward for a long while are shared concepts and shared goals and agreement on things that are central to our mental health. So everybody's aiming to live well. Of course, that's almost, you can't really imagine somebody trying to harm themselves, right? That doesn't make sense. It's paradoxical. But it takes a lot of thought to realize what it is that actually is good for you.
Yeah, I love the idea of just continuing to talk about it. that's step 1 is sending out the signals, finding
and I haven't been talking enough about it. I should put it more into the great internet. And see what comes back.
Yes. Well, this was wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. And well, you're going to see some friends.
I am.
Yeah.
Yes. Speaking of online belonging versus offline belonging. Yeah. I met a wonderful set of people through Twitter and the interintellect and, larger digital spaces. And we're going to gather in person and try to make some art together. So we will see. Maybe our next conversation will be me telling you how that went.
Yeah, and I'm the same. So in early May, I'm going to see friends in Austria and make art together. So I love it. Wonderful. I'm looking forward to catching up.
Yes, I can't wait to compare notes on our experiments of online to offline belonging.
Yes. So, all right, to the catch up.